Terrifying discovery: the secrets of the trash bags. It began as an ordinary camping trip. A group of college students from UCLA set out to explore Yosemite National Park during their spring break. After a long day of hiking and pitching their tents in the secluded wilderness, they decided to gather around a campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories. Unbeknownst to them, their own story of horror was about to unfold. Early the next morning, two of the students, Jake and Mia, wandered off to collect firewood along a narrow trail dotted with wildflowers and surrounded by tall sequoias. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine was invigorating, until an unmistakable stench broke through the freshness. Mia wrinkled her nose. "Do you smell that?" she asked, tugging on Jake's jacket. "Yeah, it's awful," he replied, squinting through the trees. The smell got worse as they moved further along the path. Suddenly their eyes fell on what seemed to be a large black garbage bag nestled in an awkward position behind a boulder off the trail. The bag was swollen and distorted, as though its contents were far from ordinary. "Oh man, someone must have dumped their junk out here," Jake muttered in irritation. "Why can't people just keep the wilderness clean?" Mia, more observant and cautious than her companion, hesitated. "Jake, think about it. Why would someone climb miles into the park just to toss garbage here? It doesn't make sense." Curiosity overpowering caution, Jake grabbed a sturdy stick and decided to poke at the bag's exterior. Almost instantly the soft resistance sent a shiver down his spine. Then, as Jake moved closer, the edge of the bag gave way to reveal something pale, a sickly bluish white. "What the hell is that?" he choked. At first he thought it might be food waste, some long rotten meat or fish carcass perhaps, but as the pulled flap of the bag revealed more, his blood turned cold. He froze, staring. Mia gasped sharply and backed away as Jake fell silent. Peeking out from the open plastic was what appeared to be a perfectly manicured human hand. "Holy crap, it's a person, Jake!" Mia screamed at him, but he was already trembling, his stick clattering to the ground. Without a word, the two of them bolted back to their camp, tripping over roots and rocks, barely able to make sense of what they'd just seen. "What's going on?" their friends asked as the startled pair burst into the campsite, pale-faced and shaking. We found something! Someone!" Jake spluttered, breathing heavily. "You have to call the police!" It wasn't long before park rangers and local authorities arrived at the scene. As officials examined the bag, they uncovered more than what anyone in the group could have imagined. Not just one, but several bags were scattered over the area within a few hundred yards, each holding gruesome contents. Human remains, meticulously dismembered and stuffed into garbage bags. The precision of the cuts suggested a deeply calculated act, not a random act of violence. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. Even in a country accustomed to bizarre and gruesome crimes, the nature of this incident sent chills down the spine. By the time the FBI was called in to investigate, rare images from the scene had leaked online and dominated the 24-hour news cycle. Headlines ranged from "Body parts found in Yosemite Park" to "Serial killer in the national parks." Many feared the emergence of another chilling figure akin to Ted Bundy or the Zodiac killer. The unraveling identity of the victim. Once the initial shock of the discovery settled, authorities shifted their focus to a critical question. Who was the victim? With only a dismembered body to study, identifying the remains seemed like an uphill battle. The forensic team at the Yosemite County Coroner's Office immediately began a painstaking examination of the fragments found in the trash bags, hoping to uncover even the smallest clue that could lead them to the true identity of the deceased. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a fingerprint. The victim's left hand, still intact despite the gruesome dismemberment, held the key. The investigators carefully peeled away layers of grime and decay, eventually recovering a set of fingerprints that could be cross-referenced with state and national databases. A few tense hours passed in the dimly lit lab, as forensic technicians ran the prints through an array of criminal and civilian records. Finally, a match popped up. The victim's identity was revealed to be Mark Hensley, a 47-year-old businessman who had been reported missing 6 months earlier. Mark's face, pulled from his DMV record, was instantly circulated to everyone in the command center. At first glance, he looked like an ordinary clean-cut man, someone you'd pass on the street without a second thought. But as the investigation deepened, Mark's life was revealed to be anything but ordinary. "This just raised more questions than it answered," muttered Agent Sarah Blake, the FBI investigator assigned to the case. "Why would someone go to such lengths to murder and dismember this man? And what the hell has he been up to for the past 6 months?" Detectives dug into Mark's personal life, and the story that emerged was both bizarre and troubling. A native of Phoenix, Arizona, Mark had built a successful career in logistics, but he also carried deep scars from a troubled upbringing. Estranged from most of his family, his close relationships reportedly included only his wife, Melissa, and an older brother, Carl, who lived in Seattle. But it didn't take long for interviews with those who knew him to reveal cracks in the facade of his seemingly stable life. Mark's wife, Melissa, was the first to be questioned. Sitting at the kitchen counter of their sharply modern Scottsdale home, her polished demeanor barely concealed her agitation. "I don't even know what to say," she began, her perfectly manicured hands trembling slightly as she clutched her coffee mug. "Mark's disappearance, it's been a nightmare. I honestly thought he just left. Things weren't good between us, but I never thought this." "When you say things weren't good, can you elaborate?" asked Detective Chase Walters, leaning in slightly. Melissa hesitated, her lips tightening. "He had secrets, financial problems. Mark's company wasn't as successful as it seemed. He made some reckless decisions, and honestly, we were drowning in debt. I begged him to cut back, to sell one of the cars or the vacation house, but he wouldn't hear of it. He said he had a plan to fix everything." "And what was that plan?" Walters asked, his gaze unrelenting. Her hands gripped the mug tighter. "Honestly, I don't know. He wouldn't tell me. He started traveling more, Las Vegas, San Francisco, even Denver. He said it was for business, but he'd come back acting strange. Paranoid, like he thought someone was following him." By this point, warnings lights were flashing in the detectives' minds. Their next stop was Mark's office, where years of financial records and personal files painted an even murkier picture. A forensic accountant was brought in to dig through his transactions, uncovering significant sums of money that had been withdrawn in cash and untraceable payments made to unfamiliar accounts. Mark's financial dealings were shady at best and potentially criminal at worst. Then came the discovery of the ticket stubs. Amid the bags of evidence collected from the crime scene, detectives discovered 2 crumpled bus tickets, both showing travel from Las Vegas to San Francisco just weeks before Mark's disappearance. "Why does everything lead back to Vegas?" Walters wondered aloud, his frustration evident. The bus company's internal records revealed that the tickets had indeed been purchased under Mark's name, but perhaps more intriguing was that surveillance footage from the station showed Mark wasn't traveling alone. In the grainy footage, he appeared alongside an unidentified woman with a nervous, hurried air. She wore oversized sunglasses, a floppy hat, and a scarf that obscured most of her features, making facial recognition software useless. "She looks like she's going to a spy convention," Walters quipped as the team pored over the footage. But the humor quickly faded as they tried to determine who she was and what role she might have played in his subsequent murder. The mystery only deepened when FBI agents tracked down Mark's older brother Carl, who painted a very different picture of his younger sibling. "Mark liked to live on the edge," Carl said, sitting in a Seattle cafe with a black coffee in hand. "He liked to pretend he was a family man, but trust me, he had skeletons in his closet. Gambling habits, shady deals. He even owed some bad people a lot of money. I told him 100 times it would catch up to him, but he didn't listen." "Do you think someone might have killed him over a gambling debt?" asked Agent Blake, jotting notes furiously. Carl shrugged. "Maybe, or maybe it was Melissa. You ever talk to her? She's cold as ice. And I know they had a big fight about money right before he disappeared." As the investigators waded through conflicting testimonies and more questions than answers, one thing became clear. Mark Hensley wasn't just a victim. He was the key to unraveling a tangled web of lies, compromises, and betrayal that would take them further than they expected. With every clue they uncovered, they were faced with a haunting realization. They might not just be hunting one killer. The chain of events that led to Mark's murder might involve a vast conspiracy, with more players lurking in the shadows than anyone had anticipated. Clues from the bus tickets. Amid the grotesque and haunting discovery at Yosemite, there was one seemingly mundane object tucked away among the evidence: a pair of crumpled bus tickets. At first glance, they barely seemed related to the horrifying crime. One officer assumed they were trash, discarded by hikers or campers passing through the area. However, the tickets turned out to be far more significant than anyone initially thought. Detective Chase Walters, one of the sharpest minds on the FBI's task force, held the 2 tickets in his gloved hands, carefully laying them flat under the fluorescent light of the evidence room. "From Las Vegas to San Francisco," he muttered, his brow furrowing. The tickets were dated approximately 3 weeks before the murder, which already raised questions. Why would something seemingly unrelated to Yosemite, a remote national park hundreds of miles away, show up at the grisly crime scene? "Let's not overlook this," Walters told the team during a briefing. "This could be the breadcrumb we need. Get me the purchase records." Using the bus company's database, the tickets were traced back to a purchase made by none other than Mark Hensley himself, the victim. This development sent the investigation down another rabbit hole. Why had Mark bought bus tickets when he was known to prefer traveling in his own car? And more importantly, who was he meeting in Las Vegas or San Francisco? The tickets hinted at a narrative far more complex than a simple murder case. But the most chilling detail came next. When investigators obtained station surveillance footage from the day of Mark's departure in Vegas, their curiosity turned to unease. The grainy black and white images showed Mark boarding the bus, but he wasn't alone. Next to him in line was an unidentified woman. She wore an enormous floppy hat, dark sunglasses and a long trench coat, looking like something out of an old spy movie. Everything about her screamed, "Don't look at me," which of course piqued the investigators' interest. "Great, just great," Walters muttered, studying the surveillance clips frame by frame. "Who does she think she is, Carmen Sandiego?" Agent Sarah Blake, standing behind him, leaned in closer toward the monitor. "Notice how she's keeping her face low, almost turned away from the camera at every opportunity. She wasn't just nervous. She didn't want to be seen. She knew someone might look for her later." "Obviously," Chase grumbled, pulling out his notepad. "Doesn't help us figure out who she is, though. How's facial recognition looking?" The team had already looped the footage through their facial recognition software, but the results were frustratingly useless. Between the large sunglasses and the extreme graininess of the video, the software came back with 0 viable matches. Agent Blake slammed her fist on the table in frustration. "She's covered every damn base. What kind of person knows how to dodge this many red flags?" Walters tilted his head, thinking. "A professional, or at least someone who's watched one too many crime thrillers." He clicked his pen and jotted down notes in his usual shorthand. "Okay, who booked this ticket for her? Was it purchased together with Mark's, or did she show up independently?" The answers weren't straightforward. Both tickets had been bought under Mark Hensley's name, sparking more questions than answers. Did that mean he planned the trip for both of them, or had she somehow exploited him to cover her tracks? The plot thickened when payment details showed that Mark had used his company credit card to buy the tickets. An odd move, given the personal nature of the travel. "Why would a man worried about his finances drag corporate money into this?" Walters mused aloud as he pieced the puzzle together. "It's like he wasn't trying to keep this secret, or he didn't think it mattered if he left a trail." Adding to the intrigue, the investigators hit another strange snag. The specific seat numbers on the bus had been noted on the tickets, rows 9B and 9C, but witnesses on the bus remembered something odd. A middle-aged man matching Mark's description had been seen occupying seat 9B, but there was no record of the woman actually sitting next to him. Multiple passengers reported that seat 9C remained empty for much of the trip. "She's a ghost," Blake sighed, rubbing her temples. "If she was even there to begin with." Walters sat back, his mind racing. "She was there," he insisted. "She's just careful. Maybe she got off the bus earlier than we realized, somewhere far from prying eyes." He paused, narrowing his eyes at the monitor again. "Let's check rest stop logs, way stations, gas receipts. This woman might have slipped off before they reached the end destination." The clues continued to unravel when agents dug into Las Vegas's bustling maze of CCTV footage. The woman had indeed boarded the bus alongside Mark, but she never reappeared after the first rest stop, a barren site in the middle of the Nevada desert. While the bus made its way to San Francisco, she seemed to vanish completely, leaving an eerie void in their timeline. "Why Nevada?" Walters asked no one in particular, staring at the map. "What's out there for someone running from something, or someone?" Sarah spoke up after poring over real estate records. "There's an abandoned junkyard about 5 miles from that exact stop, middle of nowhere. If she ditched there, it's because she wanted to fall off the grid completely." "Fan-freaking-tastic," Walters deadpanned, rubbing his eyes. "We're chasing a shadow!" But the bus tickets weren't done speaking just yet. During closer examination, lab technicians found traces of blood smeared on the edges of Mark's ticket. Though faint and almost invisible to the naked eye, the DNA analysis revealed it wasn't Mark's blood. It belonged to an unidentified individual who could only be linked to the case through forensic triangulation. "2 victims for the price of 1, Blake remarked grimly, holding up the preliminary lab report. and we're still not any closer to what happened on that bus. Or after. Walters stared out of the window, lost in thought. We're not after one killer, are we? His voice was quiet, almost resigned. This is a team job, and they're smarter than we gave them credit for. For now, the identity of the woman, and her connection to Mark's murder, remained an enigma. But one thing was certain. The bus tickets were no accident. Somewhere in the tangle of routes, timestamps, and blood smears, there was a thread waiting to be pulled, which could either lead to the killer, or to an even deeper conspiracy. First suspect, the cold-hearted wife. Detectives didn't need long to zero in on Melissa Hensley, the victim's wife, as their first suspect. In cases like these, the spouse is often the starting point, and in this case, Melissa's behavior raised more red flags than they could count. From her aloof reactions to her unwillingness to answer straightforward questions, everything about Melissa screamed, "Something's off." Detective Chase Walters, along with Agent Sarah Blake, visited Melissa at the couple's luxury home in Scottsdale, Arizona, a sprawling two-story suburban mansion with a perfectly manicured lawn and high, imposing windows. From the outside, it looked like the picture of success, but inside, the cracks in the Hensley marriage would soon be laid bare. Melissa greeted them in the foyer, her tone clipped and her demeanor icy. Dressed in an oversized cashmere sweater and leggings, she looked like someone trying to project a sense of calm, but the slight tremble in her hands betrayed her. "Detectives," she said tersely, motioning them inside. "Do you need a lawyer for this? I don't really understand why you're here. I've already spoken to the local authorities about Mark's disappearance months ago." "We're just trying to clarify a few things," Walters replied, stepping over the marble threshold. "Would you mind answering a few questions for us?" She sighed theatrically. "Fine, but I don't know what else I can tell you. I had nothing to do with whatever happened to him, okay?" Sarah raised an eyebrow at her defensive tone but didn't comment. Instead, they took seats in the pristine living room, an immaculate space that felt as though no one ever actually lived there. "Mrs. Hensley," Walters began, notebook in hand, "we understand that 6 months ago you reported your husband missing. Can you walk us through what happened leading up to that day?" Melissa crossed her arms. "Honestly, it wasn't much of a surprise. Mark, he's always been a bit unpredictable. He travels a lot for work and sometimes he doesn't think to call. I just figured he'd walked out. It wouldn't be the first time." Sarah's pen paused mid-note. "Walked out?" she asked, her tone probing. "He's left before?" "Yes," Melissa said, shifting uncomfortably in her seat. "He's impulsive like that. One time he stormed off after an argument about money and disappeared for 3 days. I thought it was just one of those episodes again." Walters leaned forward. "What was the argument about?" Her lips tightened into a thin line. "Money, like I said. Our finances have been complicated." "What do you mean by complicated?" Sarah pressed. Melissa hesitated, then gave a dismissive wave. "Look, Mark wasn't perfect, okay? He liked to gamble. I've told him 1,000,000 times to stop, but he wouldn't listen. He was convinced he could fix everything with one lucky night in Vegas. That's where most of his business trips led. Vegas. Even when they weren't about business." "And when he disappeared 6 months ago, he was supposed to be on one of those trips?" Walters asked. "Yes," Melissa said shortly. "He said it was work-related, but who knows with him." The detectives exchanged a quick glance. Melissa's answers felt rehearsed, and her cold demeanor didn't help her case. "Mrs. Hensley," Walters began again, changing tack, "we found your husband's remains. His death wasn't an accident, it was clearly a calculated act. You can understand why we need to ask, where were you the night of July 10th when he disappeared?" "I was here," she answered immediately. "At home. Alone." "Alone?" Sarah repeated, her voice skeptical. "Yes, alone," Melissa snapped. "Is that a crime now?" "It's not a crime," Walters said evenly. "But it also doesn't give you an alibi. You didn't speak to anyone? No texts, no calls, no visitors?" "I think I ordered takeout," she said dismissively. "If you need the receipt, feel free to pull it up. I don't remember the details." "It's not just about the alibi, Mrs. Hensley," Sarah interjected. "It's also about motive. You've mentioned financial struggles several times now. Did you know your husband had a substantial life insurance policy?" Melissa froze, her carefully curated expression faltering for a split second. But she recovered quickly. "Of course I knew. We took out policies years ago. It's normal for families to have life insurance." "It's not so normal when the beneficiary is set to gain $2 million, Walters added pointedly. "That has nothing to do with me," Melissa snapped, her voice rising slightly. "I didn't kill him! Is that what you're getting at? Do you think I don't miss my own husband? I loved him. No matter how messed up our marriage was. Walters leaned back in his chair, gauging her. Then why didn't you call the police until 3 days after he disappeared? Because I thought he'd come back, Melissa retorted, exasperation creeping into her tone. He always did before. I didn't want to make a scene or get the police involved over nothing. And did you know he was in debt? Sarah fired back without missing a beat. That he drained multiple accounts tied to your mortgage? Melissa paled slightly. What are you trying to say? That Mark got himself killed because of money? We're not trying to say anything, Mrs. Hensley, Walters said calmly. We're just looking for the truth. The truth, however, remained elusive. Melissa's behavior was suspicious, but not damning. Her answers left more questions than answers, and her lack of a solid alibi made her an easy suspect. But there was something about her reaction, her sharp defensiveness, her flashes of genuine frustration, that made Walters hesitate. After the detectives left the house, Sarah couldn't help but voice her doubts. She's hiding something, she said. You saw how she flinched when we brought up the insurance money. She's definitely hiding something, Walters agreed. But I'm not sure it's murder. Sarah looked at him in surprise. You believe her? Walters shrugged. We're dealing with someone who just lost her husband, or her meal ticket, depending on how you see it. She's cold, sure, but cold doesn't mean guilty. Not yet. Do you think she's covering for someone else? Sarah asked, her voice lowering. Maybe, Walters said, or maybe she's just guilty of being a bad wife. As they drove away from the perfectly polished neighborhood, both agents were left with the same uneasy feeling. Melissa Hensley may or may not have killed her husband, but she was definitely part of the story. And if she wasn't the one who pulled the trigger, she knew far more about who did than she was letting on. An unusual connection with the opportunistic older brother. While Melissa remained the primary suspect in Mark Hensley's murder, the investigation took a sharp left turn when detectives uncovered some alarming details about his older brother, Carl Hensley. Carl was known around Seattle as a successful real estate developer, charismatic, charming, and rich. He had a reputation for being cutthroat in business, but what the FBI uncovered suggested his ruthless tendencies extended beyond corporate boardrooms. It started with a phone tip. A former business associate of Carl's came forward with no small amount of hesitation. I don't want my name involved in this, the anonymous caller said, but if you're looking into Mark Hensley's death, you should pay close attention to Carl. Those two haven't been on good terms for years. Detective Chase Walters made it his next priority to question Carl. Accompanied by Agent Sarah Blake, Walters traveled to Seattle, where Carl lived in a high-rise penthouse overlooking Puget Sound. The apartment exuded wealth. White leather sofas, a massive abstract painting on the wall, and floor-to-ceiling windows that screamed status. Carl welcomed them with a polished smile that was all charm but no warmth. Dressed casually in an expensive sweater and tailored trousers, he shook hands with a confidence that felt almost confrontational. Detectives, he began, motioning them to sit. To what do I owe this unexpected visit? I assume you're here about my brother. We are, Walters replied, his neutral tone masking suspicion. As you may know, we're investigating Mark's death and we're trying to piece together the details of his last few months. We'd like to ask you a few questions. Carl leaned back in his armchair with a dramatic sigh. Of course, anything to help. I knew this day would come, though I am genuinely shocked it happened the way it did. Shocked? Sarah interjected, eyebrow raised. Why's that? Carl gave a rueful smile, shaking his head. Mark wasn't exactly, let's say, cautious in his dealings. He was always getting himself into trouble, running around with the wrong people. I told him, hell, I warned him, that his recklessness would catch up with him someday. And now here you are. And what kind of trouble are we talking about? Walters prompted, pen ready. Carl waved his hand dismissively. The usual. Gambling debts, bad business deals, shady partnerships. The guy couldn't hold on to money if you glued it to his hands. Honestly, it's a miracle he lasted as long as he did. Sarah's voice took on a sharper edge. Funny. Everyone seems to have a version of Mark that's irresponsible, yet none of it explains why someone would go to the trouble of dismembering his body in a national park. Carl's face twitched, just slightly, but it was enough for both agents to notice. He masked it quickly with a chuckle. Fair point. Look, I'm just saying, if he got himself mixed up with dangerous people, and trust me, he did, I'm not entirely surprised he met a bad end. Walters leaned in, his normally patient tone taking on a harder edge. Well, here's the thing, Mr. Hensley. While we've been investigating Mark, your name keeps coming up too. Carl's easy smile faltered for the briefest moment. My name? I barely even saw Mark, we weren't close. Not close, yet you shared joint ownership of a pretty significant piece of property in Phoenix, Sarah interjected, sliding one of the files across the coffee table. Care to explain why Mark's half of the stake was suddenly transferred to you about a month before he disappeared? Carl's smile disappeared entirely. He glanced at the document but didn't reach for it. Business, that's all. Mark and I decided it was better to consolidate the ownership under my name. He was, Carl hesitated, choosing his words carefully, in no position to manage it himself. And there's nothing suspicious about the fact that he decided to sign over his share while his business was collapsing, Walters said pointedly, his eyes boring into Carl. That's some impeccable timing, don't you think? Carl crossed his arms defensively. Look, I was helping him out. He needed money and I, out of the goodness of my heart, bought him out so he could pay off some of his debts. What's so wrong with that? He didn't just need money, Sarah added coldly. He was desperate, and something tells me you didn't exactly offer him a fair deal. Carl's jaw tightened. The smooth, polished businessman was beginning to crack. I may have driven a hard bargain, Agent Blake, but that's not a crime, it's business. Is it business to threaten someone's life over money? Walters shot back. Because we've spoken to people who claim you did just that. Carl sprang to his feet, his face flushing with anger. Those people are liars. Mark would have told you the same damn thing if he were still here. I didn't hurt him, and I sure as hell didn't kill him. But Walters wasn't letting him off the hook that easily. Fine, let's talk about July 10th. Where were you that night? I was at home, Carl snapped without hesitation. I have records, calls, emails. Check them. I'm not hiding anything. Sarah stood up, locking eyes with him. You're awfully defensive for someone who's just a successful businessman with nothing to hide. We'll be checking everything, Mr. Hensley. Every account, every transaction, and every conversation you had with your brother in the months leading up to his death. Carl's face hardened, his polished facade crumbling further. I've told you everything I know. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have nothing else to discuss until my lawyer is present. As the agents left the penthouse, Sarah glanced back at the tall glass doors. He's hiding something, you know. No doubt, Walters replied, scribbling notes in the margin of his notepad. But what? Look, the property transfer, the timing, it's all too convenient, Sarah mused. What if Mark didn't want to sign over his share? What if Carl pressured him? Pressured him into giving it up, sure, Walters said thoughtfully. But did he pressure him into taking a one-way trip to Yosemite? That's what we need to figure out. Still, Sarah added, studying the skyline as they entered the elevator, Carl doesn't strike me as the type to get his hands dirty. He's the brains, not the muscle. Walters nodded slowly. Even so, if he's not the one holding the knife, my money says he knows who is. The secret behind the massive life insurance policy. From the very beginning of the investigation, the hefty $2 million life insurance policy stood out like a flashing neon sign. A sum that large, tied directly to a victim with a suspicious death, was guaranteed to raise eyebrows, and it didn't take long for detectives Chase Walters and Sarah Blake to start digging into the details. $2 million, Walters muttered as he leafed through the insurance policy documentation back at the station. That's an absurd amount to leave behind, especially for a guy drowning in gambling debt and money problems. What the hell was Mark thinking? Sarah raised her head from her laptop, where she was reviewing financial records. Thinking? He probably wasn't. Guys like Mark love grand gestures, and nothing says provider more than a mega life insurance payout. It's like a last-ditch attempt to look responsible while your world burns. Or, Walters countered, leaning back in his chair, it was someone else's idea. Maybe someone who stood to benefit more from Mark dying than Mark ever did from living. Sarah arched an eyebrow. Melissa, Walters agreed, slapping the folder shut. She's the sole beneficiary, and let's face it, $2 million is a hell of a reason to play the grief-stricken widow. It all began to fit, the mounting debts, the emotionally distant marriage, and the eerie calm Melissa displayed when questioned about her husband's death. To the detectives, Melissa's lack of shock didn't just suggest guilt, it outright begged for it. A confrontation that unravels a thread. The next morning, Walters and Blake returned to Melissa's Scottsdale mansion. This time the stakes were raised. The detectives weren't just asking questions, they were ready for answers. Melissa opened the door with her signature composure, but as the conversation progressed, her restraint began to crack. What do you want now? She asked, her voice tinged with irritation as she crossed her arms defensively. I've already told you everything I know. Actually, we're here for a follow-up, Blake said sharply, skipping the pleasantries. We'd like to discuss Mark's life insurance policy, the one worth $2 million. Melissa's face barely flinched, but Walters noticed her knuckles tighten on the edge of the doorframe. What about it? It's quite the policy, Walters said, casually strolling into the living room and taking a seat. Tell me, how long have you known Mark was carrying that much coverage? Melissa carefully lowered herself into a chair across from him, her body rigid. Since the day we signed the papers, it was my idea. I wanted to make sure we were covered in case anything happened to him. Her words were clipped, rehearsed. Funny, Blake interjected, lowering herself into the seat beside Walters. Most people take out coverage that matches their lifestyle, something proportional to their earnings. You, on the other hand, set up a policy worth millions, more than enough to erase every cent of Mark's debt and leave a nice cushion for yourself. Melissa's jaw stiffened. Are you suggesting I forced him into it? Because if you are, that's ridiculous. He was the one who insisted on going big, said it gave him peace of mind. Peace of mind? Walters laughed lightly, gesturing at the neatly organized room around them. You mean while he was up to his eyeballs in gambling debt and watching the walls of his little empire crumble around him? That's not my fault, Melissa snapped, her calm exterior finally cracking. He made those choices. He destroyed himself. I didn't ask for any of this. Walters exchanged a subtle glance with Blake before leaning forward. Did you know Mark tried to reduce the policy a year ago? Maybe he realized leaving that much money behind just painted a target on his back. Melissa went pale, her breath hitching. That's not true, she stammered. Oh, it's true, Blake said coolly, pulling a folded piece of paper from her folder. We checked with the insurance company. Mark made a call last February to discuss downgrading. They've got notes on the conversation. He said something about not wanting the burden of such a high number hanging over him. Melissa's lips pressed into a thin line. I didn't know that, she said quietly. Didn't know, or didn't want to know, Walters pressed. Because here's the thing, Melissa. Mark's decision to keep that policy might not have been his own. Maybe someone close to him convinced him to leave it alone, someone who stood to gain several million reasons not to let him walk away from it. I've already told you everything, Melissa said, her voice distant now. She was retreating, back into herself, back into control. I had nothing to do with Mark's death. Blake pushed a little harder. Maybe you didn't kill him, but you knew about his debts, didn't you? And you certainly knew the policy would solve all those messy little financial problems he dragged home. Melissa stood suddenly, pacing to the window. You don't understand, she said, her voice cracking. Do you think I wanted this? To be here, in this house alone, picking up the pieces? He wasn't perfect, okay? He was a liar and reckless, but I wasn't planning on losing him. I didn't ask for any of this. So you say, Walters replied, rising to his feet, his calm demeanor unwavering. But here's the thing, Melissa. Your motives don't have to make sense to us. What matters is what you did when the pressure started building. And right now, what you didn't do, like immediately reporting him missing, like looking concerned, is painting a pretty clear picture. A shocking insurance clause. Back at the station, Blake stumbled across something curious while analyzing the insurance policy's fine print. Holy crap, she murmured, spinning her chair toward Walters. Take a look at this. Walters leaned over her desk, his brow furrowing at the highlighted paragraph. What am I looking at? The payout, Blake explained, her finger tracing the clause. If Mark's death is ruled an accident or a homicide, the beneficiary, meaning Melissa, gets double. $4 million, Walters muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. So an already massive policy just doubled in size? Exactly, which makes murder a hell of a lot more profitable than him slipping and choking on a pretzel. Walters straightened up, letting out a sharp whistle. No wonder she was so calm when we talked to her. She doesn't just know something, she's banking on something. And now the real question, Blake said, leaning back in her chair. Did Melissa orchestrate this, or is she just cashing in on someone else's dirty work? Walters smirked grimly. I guess it's time to find out who had their eyes on that $4 million prize. Special Investigation Team, the hunt for the killer. The discovery of the dismembered body in Yosemite National Park was not just a shock, it was an outrage. What began as a local investigation quickly ballooned into a high-stakes federal case. The FBI, in collaboration with park rangers, homicide detectives, and forensic experts, formed a special task force to crack the case wide open. Their mission: to uncover the identity and motives of the killer behind one of the most gruesome murders to ever grace headlines. The team assembles agent Sarah Blake was running on 2 hours of sleep and a triple shot of espresso when she walked into the conference room housing the newly formed team. Maps, crime scene photographs, and a whiteboard already filled with scribbled notes covered every available surface. She dropped her tablet on the table with a loud smack, drawing a glance from her partner, Detective Chase Walters. "Morning, sunshine," Walters quipped, his voice laced with sarcasm as he held up a case file. "Ready for another day of digging through nightmares?" Sarah shot him a glare but said nothing, instead powering up the laptop in front of her. "Where are we on the bags?" she asked, referring to the garbage bags found at the crime scene. Walters leaned against the edge of the table, crossing his arms. "The guys at the forensics lab are still working on it. The plastic's been degraded by sun and exposure, but they think the bags are industrial, not the kind you'd pick up at a grocery store." "That narrows it down," Sarah muttered, clicking through her notes. Her eyes flicked to the evidence list. "What about the duct tape?" "Same story," Walters replied. "Standard brand, available at any hardware store. No prints, no smudges. Hell, not even a damn hair to work with. Whoever did this," he pointed at the crime scene photos pinned to the board. "They came prepared." "Great," Sarah said, rubbing her temples. "A methodical psycho, just my type." Profile of the killer. By noon, the board was covered in overlapping timelines, lists of persons of interest, and even early sketches of a psychological profile. Mark Hensley's mysterious double life wasn't making their job easier, especially given how many people might have wanted him dead. But, as the team dug deeper, the possibility of this being a random murder seemed less and less likely. Dr. Emily Carr, the team's criminal profiler, stepped into the room with a stack of papers. "You're going to want to hear this," she announced, dropping the papers onto the table in front of Blake and Walters. "I've been analyzing the precision of the dismemberment and the disposal pattern. Whoever did this wasn't just killing for the thrill of it, they were sending a message." Sarah leaned forward. "A message to who?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Dr. Carr began, pulling up the crime scene photographs. "The cuts are clean, surgical almost. That suggests skill, maybe a medical background, maybe someone who's butchered animals before. But the real giveaway is the geography. The bags weren't just tossed haphazardly, they were spread out in a pattern." Walters frowned. "What kind of pattern?" Carr gestured to the map of the region, which now had red X's marking where each bag had been found. "See these clusters? They're too deliberate to be random. Whoever did this chose locations that are both remote and significant, hidden behind rocks, near trails but not on them, places where they couldn't be easily stumbled across. This wasn't just about hiding the body, it's almost like they wanted it to be found. Eventually." Sarah stared at the map, her mind racing. "So we're dealing with someone who's calculated, controlled, and possibly sending some sort of twisted message?" "Exactly," Carr replied. "And if I had to guess, this wasn't their first time." The search widens. The task force quickly expanded their search parameters. With the killer seemingly well-versed in both the park's geography and forensic countermeasures, they began pulling records of anyone with ties to Yosemite, former employees, frequent visitors, hunters, even campers with suspicious incidents in their past. At the same time, FBI agents fanned out across state lines, re-interviewing Mark Hensley's family and associates. Every nugget of information was turned over, scrutinized, and added to the ever-growing timeline. "Vegas, San Francisco, Denver," Walters muttered, staring at a list of Mark's last known travel destinations. "This guy was all over the damn place. How do you even start narrowing it down?" "By finding the overlap," Sarah replied coolly. She circled a few dates on the whiteboard, linking them to travel receipts and GPS data. Mark wasn't just running away from his debtors, Chase. He was meeting someone, or multiple someones. And whoever he met, Walters added, kept him quiet long enough for this to happen. Breakthrough at the lab. The first real break in the case came 3 days later, when forensic analysts connected a crucial dot. Blood residue found on one of the bus tickets recovered at the scene didn't match Mark Hensley, but it matched a DNA profile in the National CODIS database. "Meet David Callahan," the lab tech told the room during an emergency briefing, holding up a mugshot on the projector screen. Callahan was a disgraced surgeon who'd been forced to surrender his medical license 2 years prior after a botched operation led to accusations of negligence and whispers of something darker. Callahan had a history of violent outbursts, ties to illegal organ trafficking and, wait for it, served time for assault, Sarah summarized as she read the report. "And now his DNA's on a bus ticket connected to this mess." Walters furrowed his brow. "So what's the connection between him and Mark?" "That's the million-dollar question," Blake replied, already reaching for her phone. "We need to bring him in, now." Pressure cooker interrogation. 2 days later, David Callahan was seated in an interrogation room, staring down Sarah and Walters with a mixture of defiance and thinly veiled panic. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "I don't know anything about your victim. I don't even know who Mark Hensley is." "That's funny," Sarah shot back, slapping the bus ticket onto the table between them. "Because your blood's on this, and it wasn't just any ticket, it's tied to the very man whose dismembered body we just pulled out of Yosemite." Callahan smirked, leaning back in his chair. "You're reaching. Blood transfers. There are a million ways it could have gotten there." "Sure," Walters chimed in. "But what about the fact that you used to hunt in Yosemite? Or maybe the fact that a medical professional like you has the skills to perform the kind of clean cuts we saw on Mark's body?" Callahan's mask slipped, just for a second. It was enough. "Talk," Sarah pressed, her voice like ice. "Because if you didn't kill him, you know damn well who did. And if you don't start playing ball, this whole thing's going to come down on your head." Closing in the interrogation, paired with the growing mountain of evidence, led the team closer to unraveling the conspiracy behind Mark Hensley's murder. The killer, or killers, weren't just ending a life. They were orchestrating something far bigger, where every detail, from the tickets to the park's geography, was part of a calculated plan. But as the team worked around the clock, one question loomed above them all. Were they unmasking a single killer, or closing in on something much darker, much deadlier than they first imagined? Breakthrough DNA analysis, unraveling the truth in the lab. The dismemberment of Mark Hensley was as clean as it was horrifying. Forensics teams combing the Yosemite crime scene had little to go on besides what the killer had left behind: garbage bags, blood traces, and scattered remains buried deep in the wilderness. The distinct lack of personal identifiers made investigators fear they were chasing shadows. But one microscopic element, a faint, nearly invisible drop of blood smeared on the edge of a crumpled bus ticket, became the key to cracking the case wide open. The discovery, it started with a routine inspection of the bus ticket, one of the few tangible links between Mark Hensley and the killer. Forensic technician Joanna Alvarez, a meticulous perfectionist with over a decade in the lab, held the flimsy paper under the magnifier. At first nothing stood out, no fingerprints, no skin cells, nothing that screamed smoking gun. She was about to log it into evidence and move on when something faint caught her eye. "That's not just a smudge," she muttered to herself, leaning in closer. The edge of the ticket was warped slightly, as though a liquid had once soaked into the fibers. Alvarez ran a cotton swab gently over the area and held her breath as the solution turned faintly pink. Blood. It was so faint it could have been missed by less experienced eyes, but there was no doubt about it. Someone had bled onto this ticket. "Bingo," Alvarez whispered, her pulse quickening. She immediately prepped the sample for testing, knowing she could be handling a critical piece of evidence. The challenges of degraded DNA. Blood meant DNA, but DNA wasn't always a silver bullet. Alvarez and her team were acutely aware of the challenges that lay ahead. The sample, like nearly everything else at the Yosemite crime scene, had been exposed to the elements: rain, sun, and dust, not to mention the hundreds of hands that had likely handled the bus ticket before it had been carefully bagged and tagged. She glanced at her colleague, lab supervisor Dr. Miranda Singh, as they prepped the sample together. "Odds this isn't too degraded to run?" Singh frowned slightly, adjusting her gloves. "Honestly, not great. Sunlight and moisture wreak havoc on DNA. We might only get partial markers if that." She sighed and added, "But we've got new tech. Let's see if we can push this one through." New tech referred to groundbreaking advancements in DNA amplification, methods that could magnify even minuscule, degraded strands of genetic material into something legible. Dr. Singh had spearheaded the department's adoption of these advanced tools, and Alvarez could tell she was eager to put them to the test in a real-world, high-profile case. The lab process hours turned into a long, tension-filled day as the forensic team worked tirelessly. They ran the blood sample through a process known as next-generation sequencing, NGS, an advanced technique that could reconstruct fragmented DNA into a usable profile. Meanwhile, specialized software compared every detail of the emerging profile against thousands in state and national criminal databases. Alvarez watched the progress bar on the computer screen inch forward, her hands gripping the edge of the lab bench. To a layperson, the rows of flashing data and coded fragments would look meaningless, but to her, every sequence that aligned perfectly was a step closer to unmasking the blood's owner. "Holy crap, we're getting something," Alvarez said excitedly as more markers popped up on the screen. "This sample's holding up better than I thought." Dr. Singh peered over her shoulder, her expression calm but hopeful. "If we can lock down 6 or more loci, we'll have a solid match. You run the CODIS search?" Already looping, Alvarez replied, watching the system sync with the combined DNA index system. Minutes stretched like hours as the database scoured through hundreds of thousands of entries. The match. When the result finally popped up, Alvarez blinked in disbelief, then let out a loud exhale. "We've got a hit!" Dr. Singh was already at her side, reading the report on the screen. "David Callahan," Singh murmured, her tone sharp. A mugshot accompanied the name, a weathered man with piercing eyes and a permanent scowl etched into his face. Callahan's profile was flagged with multiple alerts, a now-disgraced surgeon with a criminal history that included charges ranging from illegal medical practices to assault. Alvarez immediately grabbed her phone and called the lead investigators. "Detectives Walters and Blake? Yeah, you're going to want to come down here. We've got a name." The profile of David Callahan. 2 hours later, Agent Sarah Blake stood with arms folded in front of the large projection screen in the forensics lab as Callahan's file was displayed. Multiple photographs of his mugshots over the years were arranged beside his extensive rap sheet. Dr. Singh began to break it down for the investigators. David Callahan is a former surgeon. He lost his medical license 2 years ago after a patient died during an unauthorized, off-the-books procedure, Singh explained, scrolling through the file. There were allegations of illegal organ trafficking, though none of those stuck. Ultimately, he served 18 months for assaulting one of his colleagues who tried to blow the whistle. Blake raised an eyebrow. "Organ trafficking," she said. "We're already dealing with a man who knows his way around a body." "And look at this," Singh added, highlighting one line in the report. He spent part of his probation period upstate, working as a contractor for a company that provided medical supplies, including surgical-grade equipment. "Perfect," Blake said sarcastically. "So he has the skills, the tools, and apparently, the absolute lack of humanity to pull something like this off." Walters leaned in closer to the screen, his fingers tapping his chin thoughtfully. If Callahan's blood was on the bus ticket, and the ticket ties back to Mark Hensley, then the real question is, how do these two know each other? What's the connection? A theory emerges. "Callahan doesn't scream random accomplice," Blake said, pacing near the evidence table. "This guy doesn't just stumble into crimes, he chooses them. If he was involved with Mark, it wasn't by chance." Walters nodded. "We know Mark's background, gambling, shady deals, desperate for money. What if he got in over his head? Someone like Callahan could have fit into that puzzle perfectly. Maybe Mark owed him something, or maybe Callahan needed someone like Mark to cover for his own crimes." Blake crossed her arms, her expression tight. "Or worse, what if the dismemberment wasn't just to hide the murder? What if it was connected to Callahan's history? This guy's been accused of trafficking organs before. Maybe Mark wasn't just a victim, maybe he was a resource." The room went silent at Blake's chilling implication. The next steps. The detectives knew they had no time to waste. Callahan, wherever he was, could still be planning his next move, or worse, covering his tracks. With his DNA sample now solid evidence, the team fast-tracked a warrant for his arrest and started combing through his known associates and last-seen locations. "We bring him in," Walters said, his voice steely, "before anyone else winds up on his operating table." Blake nodded, the gears already turning in her mind. "And while we're at it, let's see if there are any recent missing persons reports that match Callahan's M.O. If this isn't his first time, there are more bodies we haven't found yet." The breakthrough DNA analysis had cracked the case wide open, but it had also opened a Pandora's box of unsettling questions. Who was David Callahan working with? Was Mark Hensley's death an isolated event, or part of something much darker? The detectives were closer than ever to the truth, but they were also racing against time to uncover a conspiracy that could stretch far beyond their wildest fears. The interrogation reveals a motive for hatred. Sometimes the truth isn't found in evidence or an alibi, it's buried deep in human emotion. That's what Detective Chase Walters and Agent Sarah Blake discovered as they sat across from Emma Hensley, Mark's estranged younger sister. A woman with a quick temper and a long memory, Emma was an unexpected but pivotal figure in the tangled web of Mark Hensley's turbulent life. It had taken weeks to connect Emma to the case. She had been living quietly in Sacramento, far removed from any of her brother's activities. But when a former neighbor provided a tip that Mark and Emma had a blowout argument mere months before his death, the detectives knew it was time to track her down. Emma agreed to meet them in the bright, sterile interrogation room at the Sacramento Police Department. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, a defensive stance that even Sarah, with her keen investigative instincts, could read a mile away. Confrontation begins. "What's this really about?" Emma asked, her voice clipped. I already told the officer who called me I haven't seen Mark in over a year. We weren't exactly close. Close? No, Walters said, sliding a thick folder across the metal table toward her. But far from strangers. It's funny how people like to portray themselves differently when past conversations come to light. He paused, waiting for his words to land. For instance, the argument last spring. Care to explain? Emma's body stiffened, but she gave nothing away. What argument? Oh, come on! Sarah leaned forward, meeting Emma's sharp gaze head on. We've spoken to someone who lived next to Mark. Someone who claims they heard you screaming at him in his front yard. Something about inheritance and paying the price. Does any of that ring a bell? Emma let out a huff, clearly annoyed. So, you're talking about that argument? Sure, yeah, we yelled. Big deal. Families fight. Well, most family fights don't end with one person dismembered in a national park, Sarah shot back evenly. But there's nothing about the Hensleys that seems particularly average, is there? Emma's jaw tightened, her nails clicking softly against the metal chair frame. I hated what Mark did to us, to me, to Mom and Dad. You don't know what kind of man he was, what he stole from this family? Then educate us, Walters said, his tone more measured, sliding into the role of the approachable cop. What exactly did Mark do, Emma? Because from where I'm sitting, you sound like someone with a lifetime of grudges. Emma hesitated, her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked under the weight of suppressed anger. You want to know what Mark did? She said, her voice sharp and trembling. He treated us all like trash, acted like he was too good for this family. Left me to take care of everything when Mom got sick. Never called, never showed up to the hospital, and then when Dad died, Her voice broke for a moment before she regained her composure. He swooped in like he gave a damn, just to get his share of the inheritance. You know how much he cared about us? As much as that damn life insurance policy he kept bragging about? 0. The depth of resentment. So you're telling us Mark was the guy who blew in when it was convenient, Walters summarized, scratching something in his notebook, and took what he wanted? Including the house! Emma nearly spat, her voice rising. The house that Dad wanted me to have. I was the one who took care of them. I was the one who stayed behind, but when Dad's will got contested, Mark hired some big-shot lawyer and ripped it right out from under me. Said his little business needed the money more. And like an idiot, I didn't fight him because Mom begged me to keep the peace. Keep the peace, Sarah repeated, tilting her head slightly. How peaceful did things feel when you were screaming about revenge in his yard? Emma's laugh was bitter, humorless. You think I killed my brother over some stupid inheritance? I wanted to rip him apart, yeah, at least that's what it felt like in the moment. Who wouldn't? But I didn't do it. I didn't even talk to him after that fight. I told him to go to hell and walked away. But the timing doesn't look so great for you, does it, Emma? Walters countered, his voice laced with suspicion. Mark disappears a couple months after this blowout. Then he's found dead in Yosemite, and endless amounts of debt and property transfers come to light. It sounds to me like someone might have thought their problems would disappear if Mark did. Emma locked eyes with him, defiant. You think I'd risk going to prison over a house and a few grand in inheritance? Please. No. Sarah leaned in closer, her tone sharp. But I think the deeper story here is that Mark didn't just take money from you, Emma. If what you're saying is true, he took years of your life, left you with all the responsibilities while he ran his business. I think maybe this is about more than just dollars and cents. Breaking the facade. Emma's breathing quickened, her composure beginning to crack. Her lips quivered as if she wanted to say something but was caught between anger and vulnerability. You think I love my brother? She asked, her tone harsh but hollow. Fine, I'll admit it, I didn't. I loathed him. He made my life hell. But hating someone doesn't mean I killed him. You're chasing the wrong ghost. Then help us understand, Walters pressed. If you didn't kill him, who else had a reason to? Emma leaned back, letting out a deep sigh. Her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve, the bravado gone. For the first time, real fear flickered in her eyes. You need to stop looking in the family, she said quietly. Mark pissed off more than just me. He spent his whole damn life making enemies. And some of them aren't the kind of people you want to mess with. Revealing the bigger picture. Care to name names? Sarah asked, her notepad poised. Emma hesitated, pursing her lips. He had this thing in Vegas. Some kind of deal that went south. I don't know the details, but he couldn't stop talking about how these guys were breathing down his neck. He liked to act tough, but when he came home that last time, I saw it. He was afraid. Whoever they were, he owed them big and was running out of time. Walters shot Sarah a look, the pieces slowly clicking into place. "Let me be clear, Emma," Walters said, his voice heavy with warning. "If you're holding back something to protect yourself, or anyone else, you're putting your life on the line. These aren't just enemies chasing money. At least one of them is capable of cutting a man apart." Emma's face drained of color. "You think I don't know that?" she whispered. "You think I don't wake up at night praying I don't end up like him?" "So talk," Sarah demanded. "If there's more to this, now's the time." Emma stared down at her hands, trembling. "Look, I don't know names. All I know is Mark wasn't just into gambling or debt. He'd gotten involved in something bigger, something dark, and if you want the truth, you're looking for people who don't care how messy things get." The interrogation ends. When Emma left the room, both Walters and Blake sat in silence for a moment. Sarah broke the stillness first. "She's telling the truth," Sarah said, her voice low. "About hating him, sure," Walters replied. "But whether she knows more than she's admitting, that's still up in the air." "One thing's for sure," Sarah added grimly. "Whatever killed Mark, it started long before that family fight, and it's time we find out what he got himself into." The fateful encounter at the remote cabin. After months of chasing dead ends, the investigation into Mark Hensley's grisly murder finally brought detectives Chase Walters and Agent Sarah Blake to a secluded cabin high in the Colorado Rockies. Nestled in a dense forest and surrounded by near-impassable terrain, the cabin was barely discernible from above. It was the perfect place to vanish, or hide something, or someone, you didn't want to be found. The break in the case. The lead came on a frosty November evening, a day Detective Walters would later describe as the moment everything finally made sense. A cryptic tip from an informant, someone with ties to Carl Hensley, Mark's opportunistic brother, placed both Carl and Melissa Hensley near a property rented under a false name 3 weeks prior. Bank transactions and GPS records corroborated the story. The two most suspicious figures in Mark's life had seemingly retreated to the middle of nowhere. "They've got to be there," Blake muttered, poring over a topographical map of the area as the two detectives sat in their SUV. "Why rent a cabin this far out unless you're hiding something?" "Exactly," Walters replied, gripping the wheel tighter, his jaw set in determination. "The timing screams guilt. Mark's murder goes national and suddenly Carl and Melissa disappear together. They never even showed up to the funeral." "Something stinks about this chase," said Blake, tightening her jacket as the rattling wind outside bit through the windows. "Let's just hope they didn't plan on disappearing for good." Approaching the cabin. The drive to the cabin was brutal, with icy roads twisting through endless swaths of towering pine trees. Dirt trails turned to mud tracks, leaving the vehicle struggling up steep inclines. Finally, nearing dusk, the outlines of the structure came into view, a run-down one-story cabin with a collapsed wooden porch and smoke spiraling faintly from the chimney. "They're here," Walters whispered. He killed the engine about 100 yards away, and he and Blake silently pulled out their weapons. Blake nodded, eyeing the dim glow of light coming from one of the windows. "Let's not spook them. Last thing we need is for them to vanish into the woods." "If drama's out of the question," Walters whispered back, smirking. "Why'd you bring me?" Blake shot him a glare but signaled for him to follow. The confrontation begins. The sound of boots crunching on the thin frost layered over pine needles filled the air as they approached the cabin, their breath forming clouds in the bitter cold. Walters reached the front door first, his Glock drawn, while Blake crept to the side window. Inside she caught a glimpse of Carl sitting at a rickety wooden table, holding what looked like a tumbler of whiskey. Melissa was pacing near the fireplace, her arms flailing as she spoke animatedly. Though the muffled conversation was indistinct, their body language screamed tension. Blake tapped her earpiece. "They're both here, something's up. Melissa looks frantic." Walters gave her a quick nod and motioned for her to follow him around the back. As Carl's voice grew loud enough to be heard through the thin wooden walls, Walters whispered, "Let's not knock." And then in one fluid motion, he kicked the back door open. The door slammed against the wall, and Carl leaped to his feet, the whiskey glass shattering on the floor. "What the hell?" he barked, but his words froze when he saw the two figures in the doorway, Blake with her unmistakable FBI windbreaker and Walters aiming his Glock square at Carl's chest. "No sudden moves, Carl," Walters growled. "I'd hate to ruin that fancy sweater," Melissa screamed, dropping what looked like a bundle of papers near the fireplace. "What is this? You can't just barge in here like this." "Actually we can," Blake interrupted coldly, walking briskly toward the table. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning for anything out of place. duct tape, tools, a weapon. Funny thing about fugitives, Melissa, they don't have a lot of rights when there's evidence tying them to a murder. Melissa's jaw dropped. Evidence? Are you out of your minds? We haven't done anything. Save it! Walters snapped, cutting her off. His voice was sharp, firm. You've both been dodging us for weeks. No statements, no alibis, no cooperation. But hiding out here, pretending the world doesn't exist, it doesn't exactly scream innocence. Melissa breaks under pressure. Blake bent down and picked up the bundle of papers Melissa had dropped near the fire. They appeared to be financial documents, including records of recently emptied bank accounts and suspiciously large withdrawals. Care to explain this? Blake asked, holding up the papers. Melissa's face flushed. Look, I just needed to pay off some things before our accounts were frozen. Carl told me it wasn't a big deal. Oh, so now it's Carl! Walters turned his pistol toward Carl, whose hands were slowly rising. What's the plan here, Carl? Run this little Bonnie and Clyde act till the heat blows over? Or was Melissa just along for the ride? Hey, easy, Carl started, his expression darkening. This isn't what it looks like. Blake scoffed, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Let me guess, you just happened to rent a cabin under a fake name, withdraw tens of thousands of dollars in cash, and skip town together right after your brother's murder hits the news? Mark's death has nothing to do with us, Melissa erupted, her voice shaky but defiant. We're being hunted, don't you see that? Hunted? Blake's head tilted, startled by the outburst. By who? Carl shot Melissa a sharp glance. Don't say a word. A sinister reveal. Melissa ignored him, her breathing uneven. You don't understand. Mark dragged us into something we never asked for. Those people, they're not going to stop at him. If we stick around, we're next. What people, Melissa? Walters pressed, his voice lowering dangerously. Silence filled the room, with only the crackle of the cabin's small fireplace breaking the tension. Carl's jaw tightened as his eyes darted toward the doorway, clearly calculating his next move. Blake stepped closer to Melissa, lowering her tone. Melissa, we can protect you, but only if you tell us the truth. What did you get dragged into? Why was Mark killed? Mark owed them, Melissa stammered, her hands trembling. Gambling debts, illegal deals. It spiraled out of control. He thought the life insurance payout would save him, but it wasn't enough. Her voice cracked, tears welling in her eyes. We didn't kill him, but when they find out we know too much, we'll be next. Who are they? Walters demanded, raising his voice. Give us names. But before Melissa could respond, a faint rumble outside the cabin broke the moment. Blake gestured toward the window while Walters whispered, Is there another way out of here? The encounter ends. 3 SUVs pulled up outside the cabin, headlights flooding the darkened clearing. Figures in heavy coats stepped out, their faces obscured by shadows and the glare of floodlights mounted on their vehicles. Get down! Walters hissed, pulling Melissa away from the fireplace and shoving her behind the table. Blake grabbed Carl and dragged him to the floor as the first gunshot rang out, ripping through one of the cabin's windows. Jesus Christ! Carl shouted, his hands over his head. They found us! Blake shot Walters a grim look as they both pressed their backs against the cabin walls. Well, Walters muttered, cocking his gun. Guess Melissa wasn't lying after all. A moment of suspense. The encounter at the cabin was far from the end, but it was clear now. Mark's murder wasn't an isolated crime. It was part of something far darker. A conspiracy woven with debts, dangerous alliances, and now, a group of heavily armed strangers intent on eliminating every loose end. The trial that shook the media. The courtroom was packed. Every inch of the gallery seemed to buzz with tension, as reporters hovered with notepads and cameras ready. Mark Hensley's gruesome murder and the tangled web of deceit, debt, and betrayal had fascinated the public for months. By the time the trial date rolled around, the case had grown into a national obsession. For Detectives Chase Walters and Agent Sarah Blake, the trial was more than just a spectacle. Sitting side by side at the back of the room, watching the drama unfold, it was the culmination of months of sleepless nights, dangerous encounters, and painstakingly pieced together evidence. As the sharp bang of the gavel echoed in the room, Judge Caroline Morgan's commanding voice brought the chaos to order. "This court is now in session," she declared, fixing her piercing gaze on the packed gallery. "People versus Carl Hensley and Melissa Hensley. Both defendants are charged with conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and fraud. Prosecution, you may proceed with opening statements." Opening shots. The prosecution takes aim. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Porter strode purposefully to the front of the courtroom, her sharp blue suit impeccable and her confidence palpable. She turned to face the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice steady but firm. "This is not an ordinary murder trial. This is a case about greed, betrayal, and a chilling lack of humanity. You're going to hear how Carl and Melissa Hensley played pivotal roles in the calculated murder of Mark Hensley, a man they saw not as family, but as an obstacle." Her words hung in the air, and the jury's eyes remained locked on her. Mark Hensley wasn't perfect, no, he had his faults. Gambling, mounting debts, reckless decisions. But that is not why he was murdered. What killed Mark Hensley wasn't his mistakes. It was the greed of those sitting at that table. She gestured forcefully toward the defense table, where Carl and Melissa sat rigidly, their expressions carefully blank. Prosecutor Porter continued. "You will see how these two conspired to ensure Mark's death, how they stood to profit from his murder both financially and personally, and how they tried and failed to cover up their tracks. By the end of this trial, we will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that their hands, both of their hands, are stained with Mark's blood." The defense fires back. Moments after Porter finished, the defense attorney Nathan Grayson smoothed his tie and walked to the front of the courtroom with a casual air. Grayson was a high-profile defense attorney known for taking on impossible cases, and often winning them. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Grayson began, hands clasped behind his back, his tone measured and calm. "The prosecution has painted a story for you, a dramatic story, a sensational story, but it is just that, a story." He paused, letting silence build before continuing. "What the prosecution lacks, ladies and gentlemen, is evidence. They have theories, they have assumptions, they have their suspicions, but they do not have the hard proof required to convict my clients of murder." Grayson turned toward the jury, his voice softening. "You'll hear about desperation, heartbreak, and bad luck. Yes, Mark Hensley made poor choices, but the truth, when laid bare, will show that Carl and Melissa Hensley are not killers, they are scapegoats. And I'm confident that by the end of this trial, you'll come to the only rational conclusion. My clients are innocent." From the back of the room, Sarah leaned over to Walters and whispered, "Damn, he's good." "Yeah, well, even the best lawyer can't explain away DNA evidence," Walters muttered, eyes never leaving the defense table. A courtroom drama unfolds. The trial raged on for weeks, each day more dramatic than the last. Witness after witness took the stand. Some painted Carl and Melissa as cold and calculating, others portrayed them as victims of Mark's spiraling life decisions. One of the most explosive moments came when the prosecution called forensic technician Joanna Alvarez to the stand. Dressed in a crisp white blouse and with her lab credentials on full display, she exuded professionalism as she answered Porter's rapid-fire questions. "Miss Alvarez," Porter said, holding up a photograph of the bus ticket, the same one that had broken the case wide open. "Can you explain how this piece of evidence led to the arrest of the defendants?" Alvarez nodded. "This ticket contains bloodstains, which we tested for DNA. The results match the DNA profile of David Callahan, a known associate of Carl Hensley and someone with a history of violent crimes." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. "And what did further analysis reveal?" Porter asked, stepping closer to Alvarez. "We matched a partial fingerprint on the tape used to seal the garbage bags found at the crime scene," Alvarez replied, her voice steady. "That fingerprint belongs to Carl Hensley." Grayson immediately shot out of his seat. "Objection, Your Honor. Inconclusive evidence. Partial prints cannot definitively place my client at the scene." Judge Morgan tilted her head thoughtfully. "Sustained. The jury is instructed to consider this evidence as circumstantial." Porter gave Grayson a thin smile before turning back to Alvarez. "Let me rephrase, Miss Alvarez. Is this fingerprint, partial as it may be, consistent with belonging to Carl Hensley?" "Yes, it is," Alvarez replied firmly. "A family torn apart." As the trial progressed, the cracks in Carl and Melissa's united front began to show. In one particularly intense cross-examination session, Melissa's carefully rehearsed testimony unraveled under pressure. "Mrs. Hensley," Porter said, pacing slowly before the witness stand, "earlier you testified that you had no knowledge of Mark's life insurance policy beyond its general existence, is that correct?" "Yes," Melissa said, her voice tight. Porter threw a document on the screen, a digital copy of an email Melissa had sent to Mark's insurance agent, discussing the details of the payout weeks before his death. "Then can you explain this email?" Porter demanded, her voice rising. "An email that specifically asks, when will the payout be processed in the case of a homicide?" Melissa's face turned a shade whiter, and Grayson was instantly on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This email is being presented out of context." "Overruled," Judge Morgan said sternly. "The defendant will answer the question," Melissa stammered. I was just asking hypothetically. Mark's gambling debts were out of control. I had to be prepared. From the gallery, Walters barely suppressed a satisfied smirk. Prepare to go to prison, you mean, he whispered under his breath. The verdict is in. After weeks of gripping testimony, closing arguments were delivered. Rachel Porter's final words carried the weight of the trial's emotional crescendo. Mark Hensley didn't have to die. He could have lived to face his mistakes, repair his relationships, and rebuild his life, but he never got that chance. The people he should have been able to trust, his own family, saw to that. They planned, they lied, and they profited. But justice cannot be bought or bargained with, not here, not today. The defense, as expected, presented the jury with a narrative of doubt, questioning everything from the chain of evidence to the witnesses' credibility. Then came the gut-wrenching wait. When the jury returned, the gallery collectively held its breath. Judge Morgan asked, "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreman stood. "We have, Your Honor. For Carl Hensley, we find the defendant guilty on all charges. For Melissa Hensley, we find the defendant guilty on all charges." The courtroom exploded with whispers and shocked murmurs. From the back of the room, Walters exhaled deeply. "Justice," he said simply. "This time," Blake added, her expression thoughtful, "but it feels like there's more to this story than we'll ever know." The trial was over, but it left scars, on the Hensley family, on the jurors, and on the public psyche. And yet, for the investigators, there was one lingering satisfaction. Mark's killer would never walk free again. Lessons from crime. A tragic ending for all. The Hensley case was over. The trial had ended in convictions, the guilty were behind bars, and Mark Hensley's murder was officially closed. But the aftermath left a trail of damage, emotional, ethical, and societal, that no courtroom verdict could ever repair. For Detectives Chase Walters and Agent Sarah Blake, even as the dust began to settle, the weight of the case refused to lift. The two detectives sat in a cafe a few blocks from the courthouse, their usual post-trial ritual. Unlike the victory laps shown on TV crime dramas, there were no cheers or celebratory drinks, just two people quietly processing the cost of justice. The rain outside hit the windows in rhythmic taps as Walters leaned back in his chair nursing a black coffee. "So," he said finally, breaking the silence, "how's it supposed to feel when we win?" Blake looked up from her untouched cup of tea, her expression somber. "This wasn't a win, Chase." She shook her head. "Not for the Hensleys. Not for anyone." The fractured family. "Think about it," Blake continued, her voice low but sharp. "Mark Hensley lived his entire life digging his own grave. Sure, he ran shady deals, gambled away whatever he had, but under all that, he was just a guy trying to stay afloat, and no one, not his wife, not his brother, not even his sister, did a damn thing to stop him from spiraling." Walters raised an eyebrow. "You think Carl or Melissa were supposed to step in and save him? They're the ones who planned his murder." "They didn't start as killers, though," Blake said firmly, leaning forward. "They started as family. Every move they made, every grudge they held, it all came from years of broken trust and resentment. If you strip away all the blood and lies, what's left is just an ugly truth about people who let anger and greed eat them alive." Walters sighed, folding his hands over the table. "That's what kills me about this case. Every time you think you've hit rock bottom, there's another layer of pain right beneath it. This wasn't just about the murder, it was about a family that stopped being a family long before Mark ever ended up in those damn garbage bags." Mark's legacy, a warning, or a curse? Blake pulled her notebook from her bag and flipped through pages crammed with scribbled timelines, dates, and theories. She stopped at a small note she'd written early in the case. "What's that?" Walters asked, nodding toward the page. "Just something I wrote when we started digging into Mark's life," Blake murmured. She read aloud. "Mark Hensley wanted to leave a mark on the world. Instead, he left nothing but damage." She closed the notebook and tapped it lightly. "He built a legacy of debt, lies, and desperation, and dragged everyone around him down with him. His wife, his brother, Emma," Walters trailed off, shaking his head. "They all just became players in his disaster, whether they wanted to or not. And the saddest part," Blake added, "they didn't need the money, not really. The insurance payout, the property disputes, it was all just excuses. None of it brought them happiness. It just gave them something to fight over while everything else fell apart." The larger picture, greed and humanity. "Why does it always come back to greed?" Walters muttered, tracing the edge of his coffee cup. "It's like it doesn't matter how much people have, it's never enough." Blake gave him a rueful look. "Because greed isn't just about money. Carl and Melissa weren't just trying to cash out, they wanted power, control, some sense of feeling like they weren't the ones being hurt anymore. Mark's death wasn't just a payout to them, it was their way of taking back the upper hand. That's a pretty dark way of looking at it, Walters said, frowning. Is it though? Blake countered. Look at every decision Mark made. Every lie Melissa told, every deal Carl cut. None of them were really about survival. They were about ego, pride, proving something to themselves. That's what kills me about all this. She paused, her voice softening. We spend so much energy tearing each other apart, and for what? Nothing. Walters leaned back, chuckling bitterly. Well, aren't you a ray of sunshine today? Blake smirked faintly, but didn't argue. Emma's silence. Speaking of tearing apart, Walters started, finishing the last sip of his coffee. What do you think about Emma? You think she got off easy? Blake hesitated, chewing her lip thoughtfully. Emma's not innocent, but I don't think she deserved to get dragged into this the way she did. She hated Mark, sure. But hate doesn't make you a killer, it just makes you human. Human, Walters repeated. There's a word that doesn't get used enough in this job. She's broken in her own way, Blake continued. All of them are. Mark's death destroyed what was left of that family. Even now, I doubt she sleeps at night. She may not have been the one to pull the strings, but you don't just walk away from something like this without scars. Society's fascination with tragedy. Blake glanced toward the TV mounted in the corner of the cafe, where a news anchor was covering the Hensley case. A reporter stood outside the courthouse, cameras zoomed in on protesters and self-proclaimed justice seekers demanding harsher sentences. The media's not about to let this one go, huh? Blake remarked, nodding toward the TV. Walters turned his head and groaned. Of course not. Murder? Money? Family betrayal? It's the perfect storm of clickbait. Yeah, but why do people eat it up like this? Blake asked, gesturing animatedly at the screen. They don't care about Mark, or Carl, or Melissa. They care about the drama, the spectacle. It's like they forget there are real lives being shattered behind every headline. Because tragedy sells, Walters said bluntly. People love a train wreck, but only as long as it's happening to someone else. Blake sighed, running a hand through her hair. And the worst part? No one learns from it. When the next story comes along, nothing changes. Another family, another crime, same vicious cycle. The unspoken cost of justice. The two detectives sat quietly for a moment, the rain outside growing heavier. Finally, Walters broke the silence. Do you ever think about all the people we don't save? He asked, his voice softer than usual. Those cases we can't solve, the ones where there's no justice? Blake looked at him, her eyes tired but resolute. All the time. But that's why we keep going, Chase. Not because we can fix everything, but because sometimes, just sometimes, we can fix something. Walters let the words hang in the air before nodding slowly. Yeah, I guess you're right. A tragic conclusion. As they left the cafe, the storm began to clear, leaving the streets slick with rain. The Hensley case had been solved, but the resolution brought little relief to anyone involved. Carl and Melissa would spend the rest of their lives in prison. Emma would carry the weight of her family's unraveling. And Mark Hensley, the man at the center of it all, had left behind a legacy of pain that would ripple far beyond his untimely death. For Walters and Blake, the case was a reminder not just of the darkness people are capable of, but of how that darkness can consume even the brightest corners of humanity. Maybe the real lesson here, Blake said as they walked toward their car, is that justice doesn't always feel like justice. Sometimes it's just survival. Walters looked up at the clearing sky and sighed deeply. Survival, yeah. Like you said, we can't fix everything. No, Blake agreed, opening the passenger door. But maybe fixing something is enough.